From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The divergent political priorities of 2022 have been on display this week in Washington. Democrats and most of the press corps are talking about the January 6th Select Committee hearings, making the case for conspiracy by Donald Trump to overturn the 2020 elections. Thursday's hearings focus on the effort to pressure Mike Pence to block certification of the electoral votes on January 6th, and we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, Republicans focusing on inflation, gas prices, and the reeling financial markets and the risk of recession. And President Biden sending a letter to oil refinery CEOs telling them to step up production or he might make them do it. All right, let's talk about that. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal editorial page with my colleagues Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. Let's start by focusing on January 6th and Thursday's hearings with a focus on Mike Pence, the former vice president. Donald Trump basically took the advice of constitutional scholar John Eastman, who had a good reputation, at least before this episode, who came up with a theory, which is, in my view, false and unconstitutional, that the vice president could somehow stop the counting of the electoral votes on his own when they were supposed to be tallied on January 6th. Kyle, what happened then?
Well, the vice president said he wasn't going to do that. And on January 6th, he really was sort of the indispensable man who made the decision to proceed with normal order. I agree. This does not look like a serious constitutional theory to me. Otherwise, you'd think some other vice president could have noticed it in the past 200 years, including Al Gore, who presided over the counting of the electoral votes for his own defeat. If he had only known this theory that we know now, maybe he would have tried to do something else. So the focus of the hearings today, we're taping before them, is going to be on these exchanges. One of the vice president's lawyers, Greg Jacob, is supposed to testify. And we've seen some of his email exchanges already with John Eastman, where he's going back and forth and saying that if we take your theory, it will get thrown out by the Supreme Court. And that may have been what would have happened anyway. I mean, I said that Pence is the indispensable man on January 6th, and I think that's true. But even if he had gone along and tried to throw out the electoral votes, I don't think that it would have gone as smoothly as Eastman and Trump seem to have thought. Nancy Pelosi probably would have ordered the Senate out of the House chamber, and then we would have had a constitutional crisis, more or less, and maybe that would have been resolved by the Supreme Court. So we'll see what Jacob says today. Maybe there will be more details about his conversations with Eastman, but it is a little bit amusing to see, again, as happened after January 6th, some of these Democrats lauding Mike Pence as the patriot who saved the day.
When Eastman got Trump's ear and then talked to Pence, the vice president decided he would take his own counsel and figure out what he should do, and he enlisted a former judge on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, Michael Luttig, who was considered for the Supreme Court by George W. Bush when he selected John Roberts. Let's listen to a clip of Mike Luttig talking about his exchange with Mr. Cullen of the VP staff.
And he said, well, John Eastman is advising the president and the vice president that the vice president on January 6th can essentially overturn the 2020 election unilaterally. I said to Richard, well, Richard, you can tell the vice president that I said that he has no such authority at all, and that he must accept and the Congress must count the electoral college votes as they have been cast.
Pence went on, of course, to take Luttig's advice, much to the dismay of President Trump, who privately pressed him, we now know, who also publicly pressed him and said, Mike, remember on that famous speech on the January 6th now, or infamous speech, Vice President should do the right thing, and if he doesn't, I'm going to be very, very disappointed with him. And, of course, some people who marched on the Capitol and broke through the rioters did say, hang Mike Pence. There's an allegation that Donald Trump said that privately, that maybe those people had it right when they were saying that, although Trump denies it, and we don't have a source yet from the committee for that allegation. But Pence is not appearing before the committee, but a couple of his former aides are, either live or on tape. What do you think this all does for Pence as he contemplates his political future?
Well, it's been pretty remarkable because not only was he, as Kyle said, the man of the day, the indispensable man of the day on January 6th, but he has shown no regret since then, and in fact has spoken openly about how he felt he did the right thing. He spoke at the Federalist Society earlier this year, and a quote from that, he said, "President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election." And so he's sticking with that. Clearly, people who worked with him are openly and agreeing to testify in front of the committee. Greg Jacobs, that lawyer that Kyle mentioned, Pence's chief counsel at the time, will be there. Ludig, who we just listened to, will be there talking about it. Politically, it puts Pence in an awkward position. He obviously has, or at least did have, ambitions to run for the president himself. He's been an up-and-comer for a long time. And that vice president's role should have positioned him very much for that. The worry for him is obviously that, let's say he ran, that Donald Trump tells his supporters he can't be trusted. How many of those withhold their vote or don't come out if he were the nominee? I think that there are some real considerations about that. Now, I think that if you talked to Pence's crowd, they would say that memories are short, that, Republicans sense a bigger threat from Biden and Democrats, and that they would get behind anyone who was a solid nominee. Interesting, as Kyle mentioned, that right now, at least, Mike Pence is being lauded as a bit of a hero by Democrats because they need a counterpoint to Donald Trump. But I can almost guarantee you that would not last if he were actually to throw his hat into the presidential ring. Remember all the lovely coverage he received from the media prior to January 6th. He was reviled. I think he still has a shot, especially and in part because he has remained consistent. And that is a quality that a lot of people, I think, do appreciate in politicians.
Kyle, Mike Pence could have gone along with Donald Trump that day. He could have said, pointed to Eastman and said, we have this point of view that I can do this. And Trump and the Trump base would have been very enthusiastic, and though that would have been highly criticized in the press corps, and I agree with you, it would have been rejected ultimately by the courts and maybe frankly, by the Congress on the spot. He might have avoided this problem that Kim pointed to with the Republican base if he runs in 2024. So he stood up to Trump at considerable political risk, and he did so, I think, honorably so. And the question is, will other Republicans, if Pence runs, be inclined to reward him for that demonstration of character and principle?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, there is a split within the Republican Party of people who want Trump to run again and people who absolutely do not want Trump to run again. And similar to the split you saw in the Republican Party in 2016. And so there's a clear faction of people that are on Pence's side in this argument and a faction that isn't. And part of it may depend also on the alternatives. Who else gets in the ring, throws their hat in the ring? I mean, if Trump runs, is Pence going to run? If Trump runs, or if Trump doesn't run, is it going to be Pence and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis? Who else is there? I mean, if we have the kind of primary that we did in 2016 and 2012, you could have 10 or 15 candidates up on that Republican primary stage, that debate stage. Remember the debates where there were too many people, and so they did two debates. They did an undercard debate before the main debate based on the polling averages that people were showing. And so I think Pence would be a top-tier candidate and could go toe-to-toe with some of those other alternatives, but it depends who else is on the debate stage with him.
And it depends, if, as Kim suggests, if memories are short and the Republican electorate wants to move on from 2020, which in my own view, I hope they do. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, talking about another episode on the January 6th docket. And we're going to talk about the economy, Biden essentially threatening oil and gas CEOs as well when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Kim, I just want to inform our listeners about one other episode that you've been following, which is the accusation that Congressman Barry Loudermilk of Georgia, Republican, had led tours of the Capitol before January 6th, particularly on January 5th, and that this was a reconnaissance tour that gave people who then participated in the riots an opportunity to essentially surveil the Capitol, get an idea of where to go, what halls to go down. And this accusation has been floated by Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey. I don't think she mentioned Loudermilk by name, at least not at first, and some others. And then the January 6th committee issued a letter that was leaked to the press about Loudermilk. This week, the Capitol Police weighed in. Tell us what happened.
The Capitol Police sent a letter after a request by Republicans to look into this. Once Loudermilk's name was made public by the January 6th committee and now everyone was attaching him to this accusation that Mikey Sherrill had made, Republicans pushed back forcefully and they asked the Capitol Police to go over all the security footage and say what actually happened. By the way, Republicans had also looked over the security footage for 48 hours prior to January 6th and said there was no evidence that any Republicans had taken anyone on a tour of the Capitol in the days prior to that. The Capitol Police confirmed that in a letter that was made public saying that they had gone over everything. And what they had found on their security cameras was that Congressman Loudermilk had a tour of people in House offices. In particular, I think it was the Rayburn Building and the Cannon Building. These are not part of the Capitol. They're separate from the Capitol. They said that, too, that they did not witness any suspicious behavior by those who were taking part in that tour, that they, again, did not go to the Capitol and also didn't go to the tunnels that lead from some of these buildings to the Capitol as well, because that had been part of the accusation. Now, I think because the January 6th committee felt embarrassed by that, they decided to push back and they released some of that security footage showing an individual, two things, taking some pictures in those House office buildings and also walking down toward the Capitol on the day of the riot and saying some nasty things about Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, etc. And the implication from this release that they put out is that, see, look, he did give a tour, but it's really weird, Paul, because, again, the accusation is that a Republican took someone into the Capitol building for recon so that they could then take part in the riot. This guy neither went to the Capitol nor, so far as we know, and no one has said otherwise, took part in the riot on that day. And so the whole thing seems somewhat divorced from reality.
Well, and it's striking to me that we wrote about this in an editorial pointing out the Capitol Police letter that certainly seemed to vindicate Loudermilk's claim that he had done no such reconnaissance tours. And yet the press corps is now pushing back based on this new footage, which is really not much more elaborate than the previous footage, other than it has that gentleman marching outside the Capitol. Apparently, there's no evidence he went in. He hasn't been charged with anything. He says that he left when they started to march on the Capitol. Okay, he didn't like Nancy Pelosi, but that's a long way from the precise accusation, which is that Republican members of Congress were complicit with rioters in essentially letting them case the joint, if you will, of the Capitol to be able to go in and commit the crimes that they did. I understand that the media has this narrative, but it doesn't help their credibility when they make false accusations or exaggerated accusations and then attempt to essentially spin the evidence to claim more than it actually shows.
Right. I mean, as we were just discussing the whole first half of the podcast, what we have been told is disturbing enough. Okay, there's plenty of blame to go around to Donald Trump, various lawyers, people who kind of helped egg this on, as it were, kept this going about pushing back on the election. The rioters themselves that went in there, the footage is really atrocious, very difficult to watch. But to go, and again, this is a very, very serious charge, Paul, to claim that, essentially, this is almost an accusation of treasonous behavior, that you were essentially conspiring with rioters to allow them to go in and be a mob and potentially do harm to the vice president. If you're going to make that accusation, you better have some really solid proof. And what the January 6th committee has put out, it is nowhere it even comes close to that definition. And so you have to wonder, really, what are they doing?
All right, let's turn to the economy and this exchange between the President of the United States and a letter to the refiners' CEOs. And we've got a clip here from the White House press secretary talking about what the president wants.
We see it as a patriotic duty, as we've talked about. There's war happening right now in Ukraine that was caused by Russia, which is why we're seeing these hikes in gas prices, especially since Russia has started amassing troops on the border. We've seen a $2 increase of gas prices. So we know where to put the blame on the war, but oil companies, oil refineries, they have responsibility too. What they have been doing is taking advantage of the war.
Kyle, a little bit of a contradiction there. On the one hand, Vladimir Putin's responsible for the gasoline price increases, but, well, maybe not. Maybe it actually is Exxon and Valero and Chevron and these other oil refiners. To what extent are the president's charges accurate?
I think they're not very accurate at all. The West has stopped accepting Russian oil, and that has an effect on oil markets. But to the extent of if you were an oil executive and you had more capacity and you could immediately start selling more gasoline tomorrow at $5 a gallon, boy, don't you think you would want to do that? These charges that they are intentionally doing this or taking advantage of high prices are always political charges. And the same with when profits go up, when demand is higher than supply. Part of the issue here seems to be that the supply of U.S. oil went down during the pandemic, and the demand has roared back as the economy has roared out of the pandemic, but the supply has not caught up with that. And a lot of people are pointing at the Biden administration's rhetoric on this. It is the regulator now of the U.S. oil and gas industry. And I think there's a reason for people in that industry to be wary about doing the kind of investment you would need to get the industry rolling again and get production up again, because they don't know how long it's going to last. As soon as gas prices go down again, the White House is going to be saying that they're outmoded and they need to go away. They need to stop selling their product for the benefit of the planet. And so I just don't think that this is going to fool very many voters if we have gas prices that stay this high for the long term.
The White House, Kim, has been struggling to find something to hang their hat on here to explain to the American public who's at fault other than the White House policies. So they are looking, Vladimir Putin, obviously, public enemy number one, and deservedly so. But they've tried the oil companies now. They are trying to make them scapegoats. They are not very popular, that's for sure. On the other hand, I don't know that this is going to work, but I think it's going to escalate, because if you look at the responses from the CEOs, basically they're saying, we're doing what we can. Exxon responded in a letter saying, we've invested $50 billion over the last 5 years, and they've invested in new refining capacity as well. But despite losing money during the pandemic on refining when demand for energy fell. So, these are not charities. They're going to try to make money, no question. And when supply and demand mismatch and prices go up. But I don't know that it's going to work, although I think that the White House is probably going to do, is it's going to escalate. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the White House promote windfall profits tax. They won't pass Congress, but they might do that as a campaign theme going into the election. And I suppose they could do something with a Defense Production Act, which would commandeer some resources to force more refinery production, although I don't know how much good that would do, because I don't think there's much spare refinery production out there.
Well, first of all, there isn't any spare refining capacity out there. And this is the bigger story. The United States has been losing refining capacity for decades. And let's be clear, that is almost entirely because of regulatory policy. A lot of refiners have closed because when they looked at the process of upgrading, complying with regulations simply made it too costly. The inability to get permits has made opening new refineries practically impossible. And by the way, that was under even prior administrations. That's just almost a no-go. I actually want to give a little shout out, too, to the Exxon response because, they drew attention to this. They put out in hard numbers what they did. As you mentioned, they pointed out that they had to borrow $30 billion and lost another $20 billion on refining by continuing to increase refining capacity during the pandemic. And they actually also offered some pretty good ideas to the administration about things that would help in the short term, like waivers to the Jones Act or waivers of some of these biofuel blends, which make refining so difficult as well. Also, here's an idea. They said, how about some clear and consistent policy on U.S. resource development so that we know what we should invest in? But the White House, they're not going to pay any attention to this, but at least they're getting called out, and that's good. I think the risk is, as you said, they can try a windfall profits tax through Congress. It's at least a way to get some headlines, even if it doesn't pass. I think one of the things that more worrisome is that they end up sicking some of their regulators, whether Federal Trade Commission or someone, on these folks claiming bogus price gouging or whatever their favorite catchphrase is for the day, which could cause some costly expenses and problems for these firms. The Defense Production Act isn't going to help because there's nothing to force anyone to do. If it was possible, these guys would be doing it already. I don't think it's necessarily going to work, mostly because Americans by default tend to blame the people in power for inflation. And right now, that's the Biden White House.
I agree, Kim. It is dreadful politically for this president, this White House, which is why they're scrambling so much to try to look for other people to blame. All right, I want to thank Kyle Peterson. I want to thank Kim Strassel. Thank you all for listening. Send cards, letters, and witticisms to pwpodcast@wsj.com. We will be happy to entertain your ideas and respond to questions. Hope to catch you with another edition of Potomac Watch tomorrow and every day on your favorite podcast platform.